All right, welcome everybody. Due to a vacancy in the chair, I will call this meeting to order and welcome the new permanent members, Trish Altez, Stephen Howard, and Gordon McNeely. At this point, I'll open it up to nominations for chair.
I'd like to nominate Steve Howard.
Nominate Zach Bell.
All right. All those in favor of Stephen Howard, please say aye.
Aye.
All those in favor of Zach Bell, please say aye.
Aye.
And Zach Bell will take the chair.
All right. Well, thank you, Alicia, for chairing that. Thank you, everyone, for making me your chair. I do want to first start by just thanking Carla for the short period of time that I was on this committee. She did a great job as the chair, and of course, just to echo what Alicia had said, welcoming the new members to this committee. First of all, we're going to be going through the review of the work plan. So there were a few items, as the committee would recall, and for the new members, there were a few agenda items that were still on essentially the work docket or the work plan for this committee, and you have your copies. So first of all was the labor shortages. I'm trying to remember, Alicia, we had reached out to...
Yeah, so I've touched base with both President of Holland College and the Construction Association,
Okay.
Sam Sanderson, and they are willing to come in next week if the committee is interested.
Okay, so I'd like to hear comments from the committee if... Yeah, so there's no... Okay, perfect, yeah. So if we could schedule that for next week, that would be great. And again, now some of these things were in the spring or through the winter, but I'm assuming they're all still pretty relevant. So with regards, so you're going to reach out to Sandy McDonald and also Sam Sanderson and Skills PEI.
Yes, I can do that as well.
Okay, perfect. So the next one from the previous work plan is the economic recovery. Again, I believe we had reached out to the minister responsible for the status of women, as well as the Premier's Council for the Recovery and Economic Growth, and we had a list of various organizations that we were going to reach out to. What's the status on that?
The minister responsible for the status of women, we had to cancel that meeting back in February.
Yeah.
So we are looking possibly at rescheduling if that's the committee's wish. I had reached out to see if there was any availability, but she wanted to wait to see if it was still a priority to the committee before scheduling.
Okay, so we'll hear from the committee. Still a priority to hear from the minister responsible for the status of women? Yeah? Okay, yeah, we'll reach out again. And following that as well, the Premier's Council for Recovery and Growth. That's still something that we would like to hear? Yeah, okay, yeah, for sure. So if we could reach out again, yes. Yeah, Trish?
And I'm not sure if it's appropriate to get an update directly from the Premier's office as well on the economic recovery plan at this point.
Yeah. We could probably put the ask in as well. Now, with regards to the different organizations, of course, with the timing, you know, as we are getting into some of their busier times of the year, hopefully with the reopening plans, is it the committee's wish to still throw out an invite, despite the fact that, like I said, we're, 3 weeks away from the 1st of July? Trish?
I think it would be appropriate to send out an invite, of course, with the understanding that if the timing doesn't work for them, then that is fine. But we might also see that some groups would very much like to come in and present because of additional challenges they're facing this year. So that would be, I think, appropriate for them to make that call.
Okay. Minister?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I agree 100% that it certainly would be appropriate to extend the invitation. Two other organizations that I would like to throw out there as organizations to invite in before the standing committee, and especially considering the importance of the agricultural sector and the fisheries sector to the province of PEI. I would suggest that we also add the Federation of Agriculture and the PEI Fishermen's Association to that list of organizations.
I just missed the first group that you had said.
PEI Federation of Agriculture.
Heath?
Are we gonna, are we talking about including more? Because I have possibly some too, or do you want to leave that for new business?
Well, that's kind of what I was going to maybe ask the committee to, because again, as you can see there's a lot of different groups. Now, of course, the understanding is if we reach out to all of them, maybe not all of them will be able to or may not want to present. But maybe, I'm wondering, Alicia, if that's something that we try to, by all means, Trish, yeah.
I wonder, Heath, if the groups that you'd like to add were specifically in relation to the economic recovery. I think it might be appropriate to add them at this time. I have other new business
Yeah.
as well, but I think, does that make sense?
On that specific.
No, but you agree.
Like for now, if you have things on economic.
Retention of
Okay,
early
Heath?
childhood educators, Kathleen Flanagan maybe is one.
So, yeah, that you were talking about for new business.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying,
That
so.
sounds like completely new business.
Yeah.
But if
I see what
there's.
you're saying.
Yeah, sorry, so we're still on, the economic recovery through these were previous items, and I'm just curious because there is a long list of different associations that we have brought forward that we wanted to hear from, planning for the upcoming tourism season. So I'm just kind of curious if, and Minister Hudson had mentioned a few others to throw into the mix. So I guess my question to the committee is, do we want to just invite the whole gamut, and if we have 3 of them respond, to have those 3 presenters come in just in a shortened time frame? That would be sufficient with the committee?
I think so.
Heath?
And just, the PI Restaurant Association is likely made up of restaurateurs, which could be extremely busy.
Yeah.
Thai Pie should be okay, Chamber should be all right, and I'm not as familiar with Community Museum Association or Prince Edward Island Command, but obviously the airport might be busy, a little busy. Hopefully it's busy, but I don't know. I mean, maybe we could prioritize those letters, I guess, in sequence of maybe who can or can't, but maybe one general letter going out, and if they get back to us, fine. That's fine too. I'm easy.
Yeah, aerospace. I think if that's all right. And Trish?
Yeah, I think, we could certainly also just note in the letter that if the timing is not appropriate due to the season, the busyness of the particular industry at this time, that we would be open to them coming at a later date. But for example, the PEI Restaurant Association may very much want to come in right away if they're facing challenges that they feel that the committee should hear about immediately.
Yeah.
So I feel like it should be their choice.
Okay. I think that's fair if the committee's all right with that.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, it is an option to have in the letter, if the committee would like to include an option for a written submission in the meantime for the committee's consideration. And then after the written submission, the committee could choose to have them back in at a later date as well.
If that's all right with the committee? Okay, yeah, so that's good.
I have one more to add under economic recovery.
Yeah.
That's okay. So I noticed we have TIPI. I'm wondering about having tourism PEI as well to talk about what their, explain what the plan is in a little bit more detail to support tourism industry operators at this time.
Yeah, I would be fine with that. The committee's, yeah, we can also put an invite out to Tourism PEI. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers economic recovery. So we're going to move next to response to intervention system. Could you give us a quick brief on that again, Alicia?
Yes. So essentially, the committee's original ask was social promotion, and then we heard back that the correct term for that is response to intervention system. So essentially, moving students on to the next grade. Yeah.
And so when we had talked about that, we had talked about maybe getting in the Department of Education and Lifelong Learning, maybe hearing from the post-secondary education institutions like Collin College or UPEI, and also the PEI Teachers Federation. Is it the committee's wish to still have this set as a priority? Trish?
May I ask, how was this defined as a priority? Just wondering where this came from, if there was expressed concern or interest in this topic from any particular organization or?
It was brought up in a previous work plan, just in the concerns with any learning gaps due to online schooling and the pandemic moving children along that may have been struggling.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I believe it was something that we had brought forward in the committee, previous committee, as a possible topic. Gordon?
Look at changing maybe the title of that kind of section to more like how we're dealing with students in general, their learning post-COVID. I just think it might be a little bit narrow-based, or we could I think about there's no more grade 3 assessments. How are we capturing the data necessary to make sure our students have learned accurately, more about learning outcomes rather than the actual social promotion, maybe make it a little bit broader.
Okay.
It's just a suggestion.
Anyone else care to speak to that suggestion? I think it's not a terrible idea. So if we are still in agreement to have the Department of Education and Lifelong Learning in, maybe have them, at least include in the letter to say, can we get some details with regards to the intervention system, and maybe also a brief update as to how the last year has gone with
How they're learning, what the outcomes are. How we're testing, how we're making sure, is there any potential exceptions to testing at this time, to make sure that the kids are learning on track and where they need to be after a break and disruptions.
So, okay.
Is that something the committee would like to be a presentation or written submission?
Is there a preference? Gordon?
I'd say a presentation.
Okay, so moving on. So those were matters that we had in our work plan from the previous session. So next, now this was from the spring sitting of the legislature. It was a motion brought forward by Hannah Bell that referring Bill number 19, which is the Temporary Foreign Workers Protection Act, to committee. Do I need to read this in for Hansard or no?
No.
No?
Members
Okay.
have it in front of them, so
Okay.
they can review.
Perfect. So is there any discussion on that, Trish?
Yes, so I thank you for bringing forward this topic. I think that it's important that we, as a committee, I hope we would move on this quickly to start engaging presenters on this, since it would be, I think, ideal to hopefully be able to bring forward recommendations that could be considered for the fall sitting of the legislature, so that this legislation, which is very important legislation, will hopefully be able to be brought forward with those changes in the fall. So I do think we're on a bit of a timeline on this. I do have some suggested presenters, if that's appropriate at this time.
That's fine, yeah.
There was a recent report titled Safe at Work, Unsafe at Home, COVID-19 and Temporary Foreign Workers in Prince Edward Island. The Cooper Institute was involved with that, as well as other organizations, and it was funded through SSHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and they had specifically looked at the experience of some temporary foreign workers in Prince Edward Island. So I think it would be very helpful to have a presentation from the authors of that report.
Okay. And you mentioned some other presenters?
Yeah, additionally, well, I don't know if we want to go through like each one to see if everybody's okay with that or not before we.
Does anyone want to comment on having the Safe at Work at Home and the Cooper Institute presenters making a presentation? The suggestion from Trish. Everyone in the committee is fine with that? Okay. Yeah.
Additionally, QPPEI put forward a very detailed and well-researched report to government around temporary foreign workers, and I think we should consider inviting them to the committee as well. There's been they did a lot of research on this and looking at similar legislation across the country, so I think it would be very helpful to hear from them on this also.
Okay. And the committee is in agreement. Minister Hudson? You're good?
Yeah, I think that, and I had mentioned it with regard to the work plan and economic recovery, but I think you look at the two primary industries that make use of TFWs are agriculture and fisheries. And I think that it's important that we hear from their perspective on this as well. So I would ask that, again, Federation of Agriculture and PEI Fishermen's Association be invited to present.
Okay, thank you, Minister. But the original question was, is the committee fine with QP?
Oh, I'm fine.
You're fine with QP making a presentation, and that would be a presentation? Perfect. And I guess to follow up with Minister Hudson's suggestion, to hear as well from the Federation of Agriculture and Aquaculture, I think was it you said?
PEI Fishermen's Association.
PEI Fishermen's Association. The committee would be fine with that?
If I could, Chair, even another that we might want to add there or even put in place of the Fishermen's Association would be the Seafood Processors Association.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Trish, you were still...
Yes, thank you, Chair. So Faye Faraday is assistant professor at Osgoode Law School, and they've published extensively on constitutional law, labor, and human rights, specifically around temporary foreign workers. So, of course, that would be a remote presentation, but this would be an expert in this area, and I think it would be very valuable. I don't have a list of experts, just so you know, but this is one that I know is someone who's published a lot and worked a lot in this area.
And the committee's feeling on reaching out to Faye Faraday? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And Chair, the last thing I wanted to add on this, the committee might consider a consultation process over the summer where the public might be able to file written submissions or request to present to committee. And I think it's a great idea, as the minister mentioned, to have Federation of Agriculture and the Seafood Processors Association. I know that there was a recent article where there were some who employ temporary foreign workers who felt that they wanted to share their stories, and it might be useful for the committee to have a space where those stories and experiences and concerns could also be gathered. I don't know how we would feel about that, but it does seem like this is an important piece of legislation, and we could have an online, like a consultation process, possibly.
Yeah. Does the committee have any thoughts on that? I, being new to this role, I'm not 100% familiar with that, so I'm going to check with Alicia on that. Is that something that has happened before or is done
Yes.
regularly?
Yep, we can run ads in newspapers and social media campaigns, put it on the website, have a feedback form.
Okay. So would that be something that the committee would be interested in having for public comment? Did you have something? Gordon?
Well, I just want to make sure, do you have another one?
Nope, that's.
No, okay.
Okay.
I'd like to maybe send correspondence to the 4 MPs and attach the information and potentially the bill and get their feedback on this as well, and potentially also sending a note to the federal agency or federal department that's responsible for overseeing this and get their information and feedback into this as well. So those two things.
And that would probably be fine as just a written submission, or?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, would that be fine with the committee? Okay. All right, so is there any other points with regards to Bill number 19? Because it does look like we do have quite a few possible presenters. Minister Hudson?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I was just wondering if it's something too, but we shouldn't be looking at what type of legislation other jurisdictions, other provinces do have in place as well. Now, when the bill was drafted, that may have taken place, I can't speak to that, but I think that it would be, it'd be an opportune time to look at other areas, other provinces. I do believe, and I can't say for sure, but I do believe it is Quebec that has legislation in place that has been received, I think, both from the employees and the employers, or the TFWs and employers, quite positively. Now, like I say, I can't say for certain it was Quebec, but there is problems. So I'm just throwing it out for discussion of looking at other jurisdictions and what they may have in place that not only mirrors this, but could provide something for us to build upon too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is there any further comments to that from the committee?
Yeah, no, I think
Trish?
that's definitely a fair point. I wonder, would we want to have someone from the department come in to talk about the jurisdictional scan that I'm assuming they've already done on this, and they can present on that perhaps? Or would you see Alicia or, doing that work independently?
Minister Hudson?
I think, and it depends, I guess, when we do have the department in to speak to this, but I think it is important in one way or another that we do get that information. And personal suggestion would be, yes, to have Alicia coordinate that. My opinion.
Yeah, okay. Or would it be the committee's wish to maybe have the department present the intent of the bill, and then we can ask if a jurisdictional scan has been done? Just a suggestion. Trish?
I mean, I see value in, if it works with Alicia's schedule.
That's, yeah.
To have an independent look at what is happening in other jurisdictions, certainly. As I said, I know that QPPEI has done a lot of that work already as well, so, we may want to consider hearing from them first as a
Prior.
starting point, but, again, having an independent look at it is no problem with that also, so.
Okay. Would that be fair with the committee? Okay. All right, we're quickly filling up. All right, so I think next is the discussion of scheduling. I'm wondering if it's the committee's wish, because I know that, Gora, I believe you had a few items that you wanted brought forward. I wonder if we want to kind of bring forward our new business and then maybe work on a schedule from, because like I said, we do already have a few pieces right in front of us. So what is the committee's thoughts on maybe jumping into some proposed new business and then maybe prioritizing and working on schedule? That's all right? All right, so first I'm going to open things up for new business. Trish.
Okay, thank you. So one topic that has really been brought to light during COVID would be paid sick days. So it was, reported in the media widely, not wildly, but widely, that PEI is one of the few provinces that does have some provision for paid sick days, but it really is, it's very minimal. It's 1 day after 5 years of working at the same place of employment. So I think that there really is space to take a look at, what more we might do to improve that legislation and build on that. During COVID, we saw firsthand why it's very important for workers to have access to paid sick days. And there are different ways we can approach it that would perhaps gradually allow for this to happen while supporting our small businesses. So I think it's something to be looked into further as a topic, and I do have a couple of suggested presenters, and others may have other suggestions as well. But I'd like to start that as a possible topic we could look into. Oh, I'll also add. Actually, no, we'll leave that now. We'll see
Okay.
what others think.
Well, why don't what we might do then maybe is go through our priorities or our new list, or excuse me, our new business, and then from there we can kind of discuss what would become a priority, and that's when we can work on our scheduling, if that's all right with the committee.
We're doing new business right now, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's your only new business that you have?
Isn't it?
Okay.
I have a couple more things.
Okay.
So women's employment and the gender pay gap. So there's been a few interesting and important things to note around this, specifically. What we saw from COVID is that women's employment was impacted much more significantly than men overall. There was also a recent report that came out that showed that women on PEIs are more likely to have higher levels of education than men, but lower pay overall. So I think these are some topics that we really should be delving into, and having presentations from the Status of Women, the Women's Network, as well as some experts in this area, I think would be a very valuable and important thing to look at.
Okay.
That's it for new topics for me from now on.
Okay.
Actually.
Perfect. Thank you, Trish. Gord?
Thank you, Chair.
Can I just comment here on that last?
Yeah.
So we asked to have the minister responsible for status of women. So there's a bunch of things in that department that we could likely tie together. Would that not be one of them that Trish has? If we're doing, I'm just clarifying for prioritize once we start. 'Cause there's some stuff that I have too that might be a whole package for that department.
That's a good point, Heath, and that's what I was going to maybe bring in, yeah, because if we're already inviting the minister responsible for the status of women with regards to, like you mentioned, the economic recovery, it might be a good, maybe we can include that if the committee is fine with hearing about the pay or the gender pay gap. That would be all right with the committee? Perfect. All right, thanks. So we're going to go back to Gord. Continue on. Sorry, Gord.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chair. I would like to just bring forward diversity and equity within the public school system and as well as post-secondary education. So, and including with that is diversity hiring within those systems. Along that's for education. Keeping with that same theme, I'd like to bring Tamara Steelan, the ED of the Black Cultural Society, to talk about those issues, and as well as the micro grant program, the micro loan program within the department, but from a perspective from her to come in and talk about that, as well as various other things, how things have rolled out in the last year from her term, to talk about those things. And the other thing I would like to, I could talk further about it and get more involved, but I'm just trying to narrow it down. So, the other thing, professional development for teachers, is it enough? And right now, coming out of post-COVID, I know they do a lot of so stuff on the curriculum, sorry, Chair, during those times. Right now, there should be a focus on the teacher and the wellness of the teacher and the wellness component of the student as well. We're seeing increasing amounts of, students are learning things from the internet at a quicker rate and earlier. It's difficult for the teachers to manage that self-regulation and ongoing behavioral issues at a younger age. So those are some issues that might be of concern regarding PD days and getting them in. And then the other one was just about assessments and how we're understanding the learning of the student at an early age post-COVID. How are we capturing the data, and are we learning at an efficient rate? Because PEI has been very successful in the past, and we'd like to make sure that we have a sense of where our students are and where they're going.
Just a quick question to the committee. I think that's a great suggestion, Gordon. Is that also, maybe this is to Alicia as well, is that something that maybe might even be covered, again, if and maybe we'll get to this more in our scheduling and our priorities, but it could technically, I guess, fall under the response and intervention system, where if we have the Department of Lifelong Education Department of Education and Lifelong Learning in, we could have them talk to that, if that's the chair, the committee's wishes. Trish?
I would suggest as well, in terms of assessment, it might be useful to hear from someone like Ron McDonald, or perhaps another faculty member at UPEI's Faculty of Education around best practices in assessment, particularly in early years.
I'd be fine with that if the committee's fine with that. Okay, perfect. And was that it for new business, Gordon?
Yeah, that's it for me. And just maybe, with the diversity file, to bring in the Premier or the Minister of Economic Growth and Development to talk about culture and how that file is being, what have the outcomes been, and how he said he was going to bring back information on the grant and loan program, and he hasn't done that thus far. So I'm interested to get him in to talk about how the diversity file is moving forward.
Okay. Heath?
And some of this is, I just want to make sure that we did suggest or recommend a briefing on the Premier's Recovery and Economic Growth Report. We did, okay, so that's good. One area, and this is all tied together, obviously, in education again, but the update on the status of new care spaces in the pre-K program would be good to have a briefing on that, as September will creep up on us, and possibly bringing in someone from the early childhood education, maybe Kathleen Flanagan, on the retention of early childhood educators. And again, it sounds like you could have 2 or 3 days of Department of Education minister and whoever else with us.
No, I think that's a great idea, again, because it is coming up timely. September will be here soon enough.
And I think everything else I had was covered anyway, so I'm good.
Trish?
Thank you, Chair. So just going back to something Heath had mentioned, and I would agree that if we are inviting the minister responsible for the status of women, there may be a few topics that are relevant, most certainly. I would also suggest that if we are inviting the minister, that we might also invite representatives from the Advisory Council on the Status of Women to present.
Yes, I believe that they would be attending the meeting that we had canceled or had to reschedule, so
That's
it
right,
would be
yeah.
the hope to put them back on the schedule.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we've identified a couple of topics that might be relevant, or that we would like to hear them speak on as well, perhaps we can extend that invitation, but with the realization that they may want more time to prepare, so we would certainly welcome them back at a later date.
Yeah.
But I do think there are a few topics we've identified that would be great to hear from them on, certainly. Yeah.
Agreed, yep. Are there any other, or is there any other new business? Trish?
Just going back to paid sick days, so a couple of presenters on that. I think the PEI Federation of Labor would be really important to hear from them on this. And this would be another one where the status of women would also be important presenters.
Okay. Okay, so, all right, thank you very much. Again, I had I think everyone's been really kind of touched upon the ideas that I had. One maybe possible idea that was there was a CBC story about this a little while ago, was with regards to the cohorting for students in the fall still being in place. I don't know if, if we want to have, then talk about that, if that's still, I know, again, I think the story went on to say that it was going to be for the younger grades that wouldn't technically have their vaccines because of the change, because under 12. So I'm just kind of, I would be interested personally just to kind of hear, why they're doing that, or, if, so I don't know if that's something that the committee would be interested in hearing about. Yeah? Yeah, okay. Anyway, that's, you guys had touched on everything pretty much, except for that was one that I was kind of curious about, was the cohorting.
And just on that,
Yeah.
Peter, would you want to hear from public health on that, or who would you?
Well, that's a good question, because I guess they're taking their direction from public health as opposed to the PSB or the education department.
Could be both. I mean, I'm just, I think it might also be valuable to hear the rationale behind the decisions, which I'm sure would come from public health. I don't know if that's possible or appropriate for this committee, but.
I would suggest maybe, definitely a letter to the CPHO.
Yeah.
Potentially outlining where's the rationale behind the decisions.
Yeah.
Send the decision.
Yeah. See?
Just to add to that, the cohorting, I've spoken to quite a few teachers who have found that there's been some silver linings and some good things that have come out from the cohorting systems, particularly in younger grades, to do with bullying and social interactions and the like. So I think the perspective beyond the public health side of things, but from the teachers or the school's perspective is very, very important for that.
I think that's a great idea, yeah. I completely agree, to hear kind of both sides of it, yeah, 100%. So would that be the, like, from the education department? Like, that's what, I think it's, so go ahead.
That I hear it from.
Teachers?
Some of the teachers that are on the playground, seeing the children interact in the new ways.
Okay, so I think that is everything for new business, correct? All right, so now we are going to go back to the discussion of scheduling and possibly prioritizing. And so looking at this with regards to the labor shortages, economic recovery, we've got a few mixed in there. Also, the response to intervention system, we've got a few different things in there. With the Temporary Foreign Worker Protection Act, and then the new business. And I know there is a lot of a crossover in some of the topics that were brought forward, but looking at a schedule. So for next week, we can have, who is it that can come in next week again?
The president of Holland College, and also Sam Sanderson of the Construction Association of
Okay.
PEI.
So that's the labor shortage. Trish, you had mentioned that, I guess let's maybe prioritize what we have as topics. So what we did in a committee that I'm also a member of with the health and social development, which I found beneficial, and I'll ask if it would be all right with the committee here, is basically we came up with a number of different topics and we just kind of prioritized them, and then as a group came forward with kind of the best possible schedule, again, because we are coming into the summer months as well. So maybe if it's not too forward, we'll do just a quick roundtable and maybe give me your 2 priority items, and then we can work our way from that, if that is the wishes of the committee. The committee be fine with that? Perfect. All right, is there anyone that would like to start? Gord?
I think that the early childhood information, that would be very important to me, with such incredible changes taking place, and that's time sensitive. Number 2 would be, for me, would be the diversity file in general, or to hear from the president of the BSC about various issues. It's been over a year since some major events, so those 2 would be up there. And then I guess the retention of early childhood educators would be
Okay.
important.
And I think we could, we could probably tie that one into the first into your first choice with the early childhood. Okay, is there someone next that wants to go ahead? Heath?
Anything, I think relevance to the education, there's a lot of topics in there, which
Yep.
may take more than one meeting, but I think that should be a priority just depending on the time, and then the impacts of the pandemic. And as far as the Premier's Council, I think that to me would also maybe cover some of the other interests preliminary to bringing in like the Tourism Industry Association and all those, because then you have that plan, which I assume is done, and I don't know if you guys seen it yet or not, but that's just two, that's fine.
Okay. Mr. Hudson?
Priority one for me would be early childhood education, to roll them all into one presentation as much as possible. If it is possible, we may have to go back a second time because it certainly is going to be quite detailed and quite broad. The other, I think, though, at this point in time, coming out of the pandemic, and certainly there's a number of sectors in the economy that have performed, continue to perform fairly well. But I think that to look at the overall economic recovery, I think at some point before we get back into the legislature, that it is very important to hear from some of the grassroots organizations, whether it is TIPI, whether it's Chambers of Commerce, to hear what impact it has had on our industries across the board economically, and also where they see that there may have been gaps and where the programs really have worked well. So, you know, to me, those are the top two.
Okay. Trish?
Yeah, so the Temporary Foreign Workers Act, we will be on, it seems like it's a long ways away, the fall sitting, but when we're talking about legislation, that can be quite complex. So I think starting on that as soon as possible with perhaps with the Cooper Institute and the report authors as well as QBPEI to give us sort of a starting point on what some of the possible considerations might be in the legislation that was tabled and where we need to move from there to better understand that, I think would be really important so we don't run out of time. Because that really should be passed in the fall. It should be fixed, and we need to put forward the best legislation possible through recommendations in this committee. I think that's very important. I agree with the other recommendations, of course, also though. You know, if we do have over the next few weeks to sort of prioritize, you know, early childhood education certainly, and the economic recovery, if we want to cover some of the areas that we talked about more broadly, such as women's employment, we may fit some of those discussions or at least start them through that lens as well. So I see value in that also.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think everyone in the committee would agree. Like all the topics that we've brought up are very important, and unfortunately, there's just not enough time to, you know, get them all done right away. So again, you know.
Yeah, which is why I do think we should consider what the work of this committee can do and the recommendations that we would need to ensure that we have ready to go. So I do want to just make sure that we are not putting the Temporary Foreign Workers Act on the back burner, because we might get in trouble at the end, and I would hate to see it kicked again. It needs to get done. I think it's very important.
Okay, appreciate it. And Steve?
Very similar to Trish, just concerns that we'd run out of time before the fall session. In my brief experience in politics here, time seems like you have lots of time, and then suddenly it's just gone, and it gets kicked down the road. So very similar concerns to Trish there, and similar to the rest of the committee, early childhood education and economic recovery.
Okay, so by going through that, so I think, Alicia, what might be best, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the overlying top priorities or the things that we want to get done before the fall would of course be the early childhood, and there's a few different streams inside of that, also with the economic recovery and the Temporary Foreign Workers Act. So if we can maybe, and this is where I might put you to work a little bit, Alicia, maybe kind of get those with all the different topics that were brought forward, maybe put together some kind of try to get a schedule together. Because what is the committee's feelings, with regards to meeting through the summer? Again, we talked about this in another committee where, if someone is able to meet, I think it is our duty as a committee to oblige their time, and I know the staff here, we don't want to be bringing them in every day of the week, but, I do think that, this is just my opinion, but I do think that if groups are able to meet, and especially with a lot of the topics that we've brought forward being timely, that we should be able to make ourselves available. But what is the committee's feeling on that? Trish?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that if we are able to schedule meetings during the summer, if it works for presenters, then I would absolutely be in support of doing that. I think, while we may not, there may be instances where people need to sub in for the committee. If that is the case, that's fine, but I do think the work should move forward.
Excuse me. Agreed. All right, perfect. All right, so Alicia, if we can kind of work on a bit of a schedule. So we'll put the ask out to all the various groups, and when we meet next week, we'll hear from the two presenters, and then we can kind of rehash the schedule. Minister Hudson.
Yes, just going forward over the next number of weeks, and Chair, you have mentioned when we meet next week, I assume that you're referring to a meeting next Tuesday afternoon, are you?
Correct.
Which I am already booked up on for other. I think it is important for all committee members, and certainly I'll speak for myself, for continuity. I'm most likely not going to be able to attend all of the meetings, but I do want to attend as many as possible. And I think it's important that we all have relatively busy schedules. I think that it's important to know as far in advance as possible when a meeting of standing committee is going to be taking place.
Noted. I appreciate that. Yeah, I completely agree.
So with that, next Tuesday, I won't be here. Be off to a rocky start.
And thank you. And yeah, and again, it's one of those things, Minister Hudson, that we are, this was a group that had wanted to present, and we wanted to hear from, prior, and if they were available, and that's kind of why, unfortunately, there's not a lot of notice, so I do apologize, but we will try to keep the schedule and let everyone know as much in advance. Trish?
So would it be reasonable to say moving forward, we should all be blocking, Tuesday afternoon as sort of the time for this committee, and we can all just put that in our calendars as a repeating event, and then we won't have that problem as much?
And again, I'm not speaking for everyone, but I would say that once Alicia has reached out to everyone, we'll try for the best for the remainder of this month anyways, to try to get as many meetings in as we can. But again, to Minister Hudson's point, we will try to give as much notice as we can for future meetings. But again, some of the meetings are going to be dependent on the actual presenters.
But we do work around other committee schedules, right? I think Alicia's
Yes, I was just going to say, is it the wish of the committee for me to fill June and September 1st, and then if a group isn't able to meet in those months, to then go to the summer months, or would you just like me to, I guess, just a little direction?
Heath?
What's easiest for you?
I can do whatever the committee wishes. It doesn't matter.
We'll go try that, sure. Yeah, it's your suggestion.
Okay. Yeah, I think everyone's in agreement with that, so that's good. All right, and with that, I will ask for a motion for adjournment. Heath McDonald. So this ends the meeting on the education and economic growth, and thank you very much.